October 1768, northern New Mexico. As dawn breaks on another autumnal morning, the inhabitants of the Spanish garrison at Ojo Caliente, just north of the Rio Grande, wake from another fitful night's sleep, casting watchful eyes to the north. Though the surrounding area was well known for its relentless desert heat, conditions could vary wildly from freezing cold to thunderstorms to unyielding droughts. However, regardless of the conditions they awoke to, the soldiers present at Ojo Caliente did this every morning. For these men, who believed themselves courageous soldiers of the Spanish Empire, lived in stark terror of one thing more than any other here in this harsh locale on the bleeding edge of the known world. They lived in constant fear not of disease, nor attack from other European powers, nor even attack from most of the local native tribes whom they had either driven out or fully subjugated. They lived in fear of the Comanche, the black-clad, black-painted horsemen of death who had been wreaking havoc on the western edges of the frontier for decades now. The Spanish had, ironically, sown the seeds of their own downfall on essentially the same day Hernan Cortez had reached the mainland of Central America in the early 1500s. For, as history would bear out, the introduction of the horse to the New World would prove not only a defining moment in history, but an essentially unavoidable transference of a technology upon which much of the succeeding history would hinge. In the 2 centuries since the horse had been introduced to the North American continent, the collective population of horses in the New World gradually made their way northward via trade, theft, and inborn wanderlust. During the same time, the Comanche had undertaken a mass migration southward, breaking off from their Shoshone forefathers in what is present-day Wyoming and making their way down the eastern side of the Rockies, often harassed by tribes local to the areas they passed through. However, sometime in the mid to early 1600s, the Comanche had come into contact with the horse, and, in what amounts to the historical blink of an eye, they had gone from bipedal whipping boys to some of the most adept cavalrymen on the planet. Their turnaround had been stark, swift, and startlingly violent. Their longtime foes, tribes like the Apache, were driven from their homelands in Texas and New Mexico. Comanche raids, though, were not solely military endeavors intent on killing their enemies and taking their lands. They were the means by which the Comanche economy ran. The spoils of victory, be they weapons, horses, foodstuffs, or oftentimes captives who were treated as subhuman slaves. The Comanche were notorious for the brutal treatment they inflicted upon their prisoners. While adoption of younger captives was not wholly uncommon, the abuse and subjugation of female captives was the norm. The Comanche viewed the captives that they adopted as fully recognized members of the tribe, but viewed those they did not as something altogether less than human, and they treated them as such. The Comanche dealt in an extensive, empire-wide slave trade that rivaled or equaled the transatlantic and Arabic slave trades in their brutality and inhumanity, if not in transcontinental scope. While there was certainly a market for powerful, wealthy New Mexican oligarchs to purchase back captives to return to their families, there was also a large market for slave labor among the wealthy ranchers and politicians of the territory. A resident Spanish Catholic priest at Ojo Viejo, Fray Andres Varro, gave the following first-hand account of one of the many trade fairs that were held for the Comanche by many of the local New Mexico governors in various locations throughout large swaths of eastern and southern New Mexico. Quote, "Here, in short, is gathered everything possible for trade and barter with these barbarians in exchange for buffalo hides, and, what is saddest, in exchange for Indian slave, men and women, small and large, and a great multitude of both sexes, for they are the gold and silver and richest treasures of the governors." Fray Varro goes on to describe, in horrified tones, the treatment of the female captives by the Comanche. Quote, "They corrupt them in sight of innumerable assemblies of barbarians and Catholics, saying to those who buy them with heathen imprudence, 'Now you can take her. Now she is good.'" The Comanche, no strangers to psychological warfare, used the accounts of their raids and treatment of prisoners to stir up terror and build an aura of invincibility throughout the burgeoning empire. However, they also contrasted their propensity for startling levels of violence with a keen sense of diplomacy. Throughout the decades, they had alternately established, renounced, and re-established several peace treaties with different townships in the area. However, the decentralized structure of Comanche society made any kind of sustainable peace agreement nearly impossible to establish. Though they were often referred to as a singular nation, the Comanche did not operate as one unified entity. Rather, several autonomous bands comprised what was known on its whole as the Comanche Nation. Before the 1750s, three primary bands comprised the Comanche: the Yamparicas, the Jupes, and the Catsotecas. By the 19th century, the diaspora of Comanche bands had expanded significantly. By this point, many observers of the Comanche began to refer to them in three distinct groups: the Northern Comanche, the Middle Comanche, and the Southern Comanche. The Yamparica, or root eaters, and the Catsoteca, or buffalo eaters, occupied the northernmost areas of Comancheria, in present-day Kansas and Colorado. The Noconi, or movers, held sway over the eastern reaches in present-day New Mexico. Located south of them were the Tenawa, or those who lived downstream, as well as the Tanima, or liver eaters. These groups were known as the Middle Comanche. The Panateca, or honey eaters, occupied the Edwards Plateau in central Texas. They were the largest band and known as the Southern Comanche. Other bands would continue to break off and operate as autonomous but cohesive entities well into the 19th century. The Coahati, or antelope eaters, moved out of the plains of the Llano Estacado in Texas in the 19th centuries. By the 19th century, they were known as the Western Comanche. These ever-evolving intra-tribal dynamics made attaining a tribal-wide consensus on anything from peace treaties to trading agreements a nearly impossible task. The Spanish had come to these northernmost outreaches of their self-proclaimed empire in the 16th century, bringing with them cattle, sheep, agriculture, Catholicism, firearms, and horses. They had swept north after conquering the Aztecs, either subjugating or eliminating the native tribes they had encountered on their deliberate, decisive push into the territories of the New World. By 1768, Taos and Santa Fe had been established trading spots for centuries. They were also subject to the constantly alternating and occasionally simultaneous Comanche practices of trading with and making raids upon the local ranches and outposts. 3 months before this October morning, a band of 400 Comanche, believed to have been Catsoteca, had made their way into Taos, roughly 40 miles east of Ojo Caliente, under the auspices of desiring peaceful trade with the local merchants. This was not altogether uncommon, though it must have been an unnerving experience for even the most inveterate traders and Taos residents. On this day, though, the Comanche had not only been peaceable, they had been downright amiable. Smiles and charity were the order of the day, as residents traded and bartered, conversed and competed in horse races and games of chance. But in the Comanche's joviality lie their Machiavellian genius. Though they had no knowledge of the cynical 16th century Italian political philosopher, it is safe to assume that the Comanches would likely have appreciated his work if they did. For they viewed themselves as rightful rulers of a seemingly endless domain, ones who did not have the luxury of indulging in moral scrupulosity when they had an empire to run. This trading contingent had certainly come to Taos to trade and acquire goods, but they were also a distraction. For on that same morning, a group of 100 Catsoteca warriors had swept down upon the Spanish at Ojo Caliente. Despite their best attempts on that day, though, the Comanche attack had failed. The Spanish soldiers, well-armed and well-trained, had managed to respond in time to the Comanche attack, killing and injuring a number of Comanche warriors within the first few volleys. Like virtually all native tribes on the North and South American continent, the Comanche martial tradition did not include sacrificing the lives of their warriors to make territorial gains. The remaining warriors retreated across the nearby river, with a number being lost to drowning. 1 or 2 of the riders were sent as messengers to alert their brethren in Taos, while the remainder fled to the open expanses of the prairie to the north. When they were informed of the loss of their fellow tribesmen, the Comanche there also rapidly exited the territory, rejoining their brethren from the raiding party in the north, but not before killing 5 Spanish settlers and 1 Taoseño native. Once reunited with the raiding party, they undoubtedly engaged in the traditional Comanche mourning practices, self-mortification, which might take place anywhere on a spectrum from cutting one's hair short to lopping off digits, as well as the killing of the slain warrior's horses and the dispensation of his family and property amongst the rest of the tribe. However, once the physical and emotional wounds caused by the losses of loved ones healed, the next order of business was, as is all too common in the human experience, revenge. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of mornings just like this, in which the Spanish soldiers would wake from a fitful night's sleep, check their weapons, and make ready for their day. Every morning, they had wondered if that morning might be the morning that they would see the dreaded silhouettes of Comanches riding at them at full bore, returning to exact their pound of flesh for the wrongs done to them. 4 weeks before this day, a small party of 24 young Comanche raiders had made an ill-advised attempt at attacking the well-armed Presidio, with all but one of them being killed. The lone Comanche survivor was taken captive by the Spanish. From him, they learned of a new leader who was on the rise amongst the Comanche. The prisoner described a Katsoteca war chief whose exploits had garnered him great renown and support within his band. He seemed to know no fear, and it was believed that he had derived great medicine or puha from his distinctive buffalo-horned headdress. Accounts of the headdress vary, with descriptions of both a 2-horned version with a buffalo horn on either side or a single-horn version with the singular horn placed turned up and on the forehead. In either account, though, the horns were painted green. This garnered him the name Cuerno Verde, from the Spanish meaning greenhorn. In his work, Comanche Political History and Ethno-Historical Perspective 1708 to 1875, anthropologist Thomas Cavanaugh described the chief thusly. He had a guard of armed men, pages to help in mounting and dismounting, a sunshade of buffalo hide, as well as 2 confidants to carry out his orders, one of whom was among those killed at Ojo Caliente. The young Comanche warrior, being held prisoner, warned the Spanish time and again that his party's failure to return would lead to the tribe's assumption that the young raiding party who had gone out to raid Ojo Caliente had been killed. When they reached this conclusion, Cuerno Verde would marshal his forces and be on his way south toward this small presidio in the middle of nowhere. The day was fast approaching, he cautioned them, that Cuerno Verde would come to Ojo Caliente to take his revenge. Finally, the day arrived. Though there are no formal first-hand accounts from that morning, the routine would have been the same as all the others. Breakfasts of tortillas and beans mixed with local chilies would likely be prepared in traditional horno outdoor ovens that had been adapted by the Spanish from the local indigenous peoples, such as the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. They may have attended a mass that morning with the priest of the Presidio. The inclusion of Catholic priests on all frontier endeavors was considered mandatory by the Catholic Spanish kingdom. They would then begin checking over and donning the tools of their trade. Though their predecessors, men such as Francisco Pizarro, Juan Ponce de Leon, and Hernan Cortez, had donned elaborate, heavy metal armor, these men were clad in lighter, more flexible, and comparatively more breathable leather armor better suited to the harsh desert environs. They were known as soldados de cuera, or leather jacket soldiers. The jackets were constructed of multiple layers of deer hide that had been stitched together to form a sort of 18th century Kevlar vest. Fray Juan Crespi, a Spanish priest who served in many presidios throughout the West during this time, gives the following description of the, at the time, state-of-the-art armor. Quote, "The cuera, which gave them their name, was a leather jacket, like a coat without sleeves, proof against the Indians' arrows except at very close range. For additional armor they had shields and shaps. The shields, carried off the left arm, were made of 2 plies of bull's hide, and would turn either arrow or spear. The leather shaps or aprons, fashioned to the pommel of the saddle, protected legs and thighs from the brush and cactus spines." End quote. The soldados were armed with an escopeta or carbine, a pair of single-shot pistols, a bow, a sword, and a lance. As an added defensive measure, a soldado might choose between two types of shields, the first being the larger bullhide shield known as an adarga for use in establishing a more stationary defensive position, the second being a small round metal shield known as a rodela for use in close quarters combat. The soldados recruited heavily from the mestizo population, those of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, as well as from the natives who had come to convert to Christianity, and from freed slaves. Most of the officers, though, were full-blooded Spaniards who had been born in the New World. They were known as criollos. For both officers and enlisted men, service in the soldados presented several enticing benefits: regular pay, access to medical care, and the possibility of being granted portions of land upon completing their term of service. Recruitment was usually a local affair, as this was a much more pragmatic measure than recruiting from abroad and taking the time to acclimate troops to the harsh localities to which they would be stationed. Thus, while again the written record for the Presidio at Ojo Caliente in 1768 is less than substantial, it is a safe assumption that the vast majority of the soldados present that day had been born and raised in and around the surrounding territories. But no matter how acclimated they were to the weather, nor even how accustomed their nerves were to the rigors of combat, what they saw that morning, silhouetted against the rising sun, as they were alerted by their sentries and crowded to the Presidio's adobe walls to procure a better view, must have sent a collective chill down their spines. The breath of both man and beast hung in the cool morning air, as the heavy breathing of the warriors and their mounts created a mist through which their lines seemed to crash as they moved forward. Where minutes before there had been an empty horizon, now appeared 500 Comanche warriors, painted black and with minimal adornments, bearing down on the Presidio at full speed. Comanche tactics, similar to other light cavalry superpowers like the Huns and Mongols, did not approach entrenched positions via linear head-on attacks. Instead, warriors would ride in tight concentric circles that rotated as they moved towards their target. As they approached, the rider nearest the target would loose their arrow, before their circular path took them to cover at the back of the circle, also affording them time to reload before finding themselves nearest the target again. This created, in effect, a giant human Gatling gun that enabled the Comanche to dwarf the rate of fire presented by the Spanish with their muzzle-loading carbines. The Comanche used short bows, again much like their Mongol and Hun predecessors half a world away, that held a draw weight well over 100 pounds. This was mitigated by the fact that they were not made to be brought to full draw with the hand holding the arrow brought below the archer's eye, but drawn back only a few inches and released in more of a shoot-from-the-hip fashion. Like the soldados, they too carried large leather shields. These, when angled properly, could and often did deflect musket balls. Also, like their soldado opponents, they carried long lances, some being documented as up to 14 feet long. These were designed to thrust into buffalo from a reasonably safe distance, but could be just as effectively wielded against human targets. Some amongst the Comanche carried carbines of their own, acquired through trading or raid, but at this time they were far less common amongst native tribes due to their unreliability and frequent need of maintenance that few, if any, natives were able to provide. Want of gunsmithing services was so prevalent, in fact, that it would be worked into many treaties with the United States and Mexican governments as a necessary term of agreement. Even the relatively well-trained and well-equipped soldados could, at best, hope to get off 2 to 4 rounds a minute from their carbines. However, with the added advantage of their organization, tactics, and substantial cover provided by the Presidio walls, this would be a hard-fought fight for both parties. As the soldados took up their positions and steadied their arms, waiting for their officer's command to fire, they surveyed the battlefield that lay before them, in the barren hinterlands of today's New Mexico. Even in the early morning's fleeting illumination, one figure amongst the seemingly demonic horde barreling at them stood out amongst the rest. He was not an exceptionally large man, but his demeanor and body language indicated that he was clearly in command of this band of warriors, and the green-horned headdress that he wore, beneath which his eyes burned intently and angrily, indicated that this was Cuerno Verde. As the arrows began to rain down, and the Comanche war party advanced upon them in several of their cyclonic attack formations, the soldados loosened their initial volley at the command of their officer. Everyone inside the Presidio was well aware of the stakes at hand. Should they be overrun, those among them who were not killed outright would suffer torturous deaths at the hands of the Comanche. Again and again, the soldados repeated the actions of firing and reloading their carbines, their well-trained digits struggling with the numbing effects of the morning chill. The din of gunfire, commanders' exhortations, war cries, and the lamentations of the wounded and dying filled the air, along with the acrid aroma of gun smoke. Meanwhile, Cuerno Verde continued his relentless press towards the Presidio, urging his warriors on and darting from formation to formation, loosing arrows all the while reports of his treatment amongst his people as a little king were likely to have been exaggerated by his enemies seeking to paint him as a haughty war chief, Cuerno Verde was indeed a fierce warrior, one who had earned the respect of his people through the only means available to any young Comanche man: prowess on the battlefield. Cuerno Verde had not only survived in this harsh, Spartan-esque world, he had thrived in it. His wife was happy and well-fed. His young son was fast becoming the apparent rightful heir to his father's legacy, and the warriors who had followed him on this raid, all 500 of them, trusted him implicitly with their lives. Cuerno Verde likely did view himself as less of a king, but more of a distinguished member of a collective empire that had been built by the Comanche and was inherently theirs to uphold, defend, and expand. These Spanish, like the Apache, Navajo, and Ute they had also warred with over the years, were not of his people, and thus had no right on his land. And, for the crime of killing dozens of their young warriors over the past year, he intended that these interlopers pay with their lives. Cuerno Verde's blood ran hot, his blood soaking the cap of his buffalo hide headdress, and as he came nearer and nearer the Presidio walls, he could almost feel the will of the Spanish breaking. Then, from an unknown soldado, a shot rang out. Cuerno Verde was struck in the chest by a Spanish bullet and fell from his horse. For a brief instant, a shocked silence seemed to fall over the whole of the battlefield. Then, almost as suddenly, a collective howl went up amongst the warriors as all present turned in retreat. To the Comanche, the killing of a war chief meant the medicine behind the raid had gone bad. Seeing Cuerno Verde fall was evidence that his raid no longer had divine favor, and that a retreat must be made. But while the Comanche Code of Conduct made no provisions for the sacrificing of warriors to obtain positions solely for the position's sake, they were renowned, even in 1768, for their willingness to put themselves in harm's way in order to recover the bodies of their slain warriors if at all possible. In this instance, Cuerno Verde's compatriots were able to make off with his lifeless body, headdress still intact. They disappeared over the horizon, and the Spanish, aware of the common tactic of false retreats baiting pursuers into ambushes, saw fit to ensconce themselves even more firmly within the walls of the Presidio. As the soldados used the time to refortify their positions, to send word to Taos for any available reinforcements, the Comanche made their way north, again onto the open plains of today's Colorado. When they arrived back at their camp, carrying the body of the slain Cuerno Verde, a collective wail rose up amongst the entirety of those present, as the loss of such a great war chief was so keenly felt. What was worse, it had come at the hands of the newest, most hubristic intruders into their empire, the leather-clad and carbine-wielding Spanish. Cuerno Verde's horses, a Comanche chief of his status would likely have at least a few hundred, were all killed by hand, being sent with him to the afterworld to continue serving their master. As was their obligation, Cuerno Verde's widow was taken care of by the families of his warriors. Cuerno Verde's son would also take up his obligation, one of revenge. His father had named him Tabibo Narikant, meaning dangerous man, And while this was certainly apt, history would see him assume the mantle of his father in avenging his death. In a few short years, the soldados would again shudder at the sight of a mighty, green-horned warrior rushing down upon them with fury untold. Unsure at first whether or not the mighty warrior had been killed at all, or maybe even returned from the dead, they would begin to refer to him under the same moniker as they had his father. He would be known as Cuerno Verde, and it would be he who history would recall as such, as his legend would spread farther and wider than even his legendary fathers. Tales all over the Spanish settlements in what is now New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas told of the brutality and violence wrought by the war chief against whose very existence implied support for the killing of his beloved father. The Spanish would pursue him in vain for years, until a legendary figure of their own, a man named Juan Bautista de Anza, came to the territory. In 1776, he had led an expedition to Alta California and helped found what is today San Francisco. Upon his return to the territory, he was made aware of the havoc being unleashed by Cuerno Verde and his raiders, and made it his mission to track them down. It would be years later before they would finally meet on the plains of Colorado. In the intervening time, he would lead expeditions over thousands of miles. Cuerno Verde would continue his quest for revenge via years of horrifically violent warfare, and the Comanche as a whole would be devastated by the deadliest enemy any native tribe could encounter: smallpox. The intervening decade would see the Comanche devastated, the Spanish Empire reformed, and the fate of nations changed forever. But those, like countless other stories from Comanche and Spanish history, are other stories for other times.